Captain Jenkins stood on the ridge, his gaze fixed on the approaching alien army. Their ships hovered like ominous clouds, casting long shadows over the landscape, their technology far beyond anything Earth had ever seen. The ground beneath his feet rumbled as the alien forces marched forward in perfect formation. He could hear the distinct hum of their energy shields, a low-frequency vibration that sent a chill through his bones. "Sir, they're getting closer." Lieutenant O'Donnell's voice broke through the steady rhythm of the alien advance. He was younger, still green in the face of war, but eager to prove himself. His wide eyes reflected the disbelief of everyone who had seen the invaders' technology up close. How could they possibly fight back with something as archaic as artillery? Jenkins didn't turn to look at him. His focus remained on the horizon where the alien command ship loomed, its sleek surface shimmering in the afternoon sun. "They're not close enough yet," he muttered, his voice steady, betraying no hint of the uncertainty gnawing at his gut. A laugh echoed across the battlefield, distorted through loudspeakers. The alien warlord Kartok, his voice dripping with condescension, mocked them from atop his command platform. "Seriously? This can't even kill a duck." Jenkins' jaw clenched. He had heard the warlord's voice in broadcasts over the past week, taunting Earth's defenses, belittling humanity's weapons. This was the first time he'd heard it in person, and it stoked a slow-burning fire in his chest. The Howitzer stood in a row behind Jenkins and his men, massive and seemingly outdated against the backdrop of alien technology. The artillery crews worked in silence, their faces grim as they loaded the first rounds. Each shell was a carefully calibrated piece of Earth's last-ditch effort to resist the invasion, a payload designed not just to explode, but to disrupt the alien shields. "They think we're weak," O'Donnell said, his voice trembling as he adjusted his binoculars. "They have no idea what we're about to hit them with." Jenkins nodded slightly, though his eyes never left the approaching army. "No, they don't." He had overseen the development of these specialized shells for months in secret, under the direct orders of the Earth Defense Council. Every test, every calculation, had been for this moment. And now, as the alien warlords confidently marched their forces forward, shields shimmering in the afternoon light, Jenkins knew it was time to show them the truth. "Ready the guns?" he ordered. O'Donnell barked the command to the artillery crews, who moved with practiced precision. The howitzers, ancient by galactic standards, groaned as they shifted into position, their barrels aimed directly at the center of the alien line. Kartok's mocking laughter continued, now joined by the jeers of his soldiers, confident that their shields would hold. Jenkins watched, his heartbeat steady, as the first howitzer round was loaded and the crew stepped back, awaiting his signal. He could feel the tension in the air, the anticipation, the doubt from his men. They trusted him, but they hadn't seen the tests. They hadn't seen what these shells could do. "Fire!" The word left his mouth in a low, controlled tone, but the response was immediate. The first shell erupted from the howitzer with a deafening roar, slicing through the air toward the alien army. Jenkins followed its path with his eyes, watching as it hurtled toward the enemy line, a streak of destruction in the making. The shell struck the alien shield with a flash of light. For a brief moment, the shield shimmered, holding against the impact. Kartok's laughter grew louder, his arrogance palpable. But then, something changed. The shield flickered, a crack of energy rippling outward from the point of impact. Jenkins allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The specialized explosives worked. A ripple of energy cascaded through the alien shield generators, and within seconds, the entire shield grid collapsed. The warlords' jeers turned into shouts of confusion and panic as their once impenetrable defenses evaporated. "Sir!" O'Donnell's voice was breathless with astonishment. "It worked! Their shields are down!" Jenkins remained calm, though a surge of adrenaline coursed through him. "Prepare for a full barrage." Behind them, the artillery crews scrambled to load the next rounds, their fear replaced by a growing sense of hope. The howitzers, once mocked by the alien warlords, had just turned the tide of the battle. Across the battlefield, the alien forces hesitated, their perfect formation beginning to falter without their shields. Talk, still on his platform, shouted orders, trying to regain control of his troops. But it was too late. Fire! Jenkins ordered again, his voice cutting through the chaos. The second round of shells erupted from the howitzers, raining down on the alien lines with devastating precision. Explosions rocked the battlefield as alien ships were torn apart, their energy systems overloaded by the impact. Jenkins watched, his face expressionless, as the once unstoppable alien army began to crumble under the weight of Earth's artillery. "Look at them," O'Donnell said in disbelief, his eyes wide. "They're falling apart." Jenkins lowered his binoculars, his mind already racing ahead to the next step. This was only the beginning. The Warlords had underestimated Earth, but they wouldn't make that mistake again. Jenkins knew they would regroup, and when they did, they would come back with something worse. "They're retreating, sir," O'Donnell said, pointing toward the alien ships beginning to pull back. Jenkins' eyes narrowed. "Not yet, they're not." He turned to the artillery crews, his voice hard. "Load the guided munitions." The men hesitated for only a moment before springing into action. These were Earth's most advanced rounds, capable of tracking the enemy even as they fled. It was a last resort, but now was the time to strike the final blow. "Fire!" Jenkins ordered. The guided shells arced into the sky, streaking toward the retreating alien ships. Jenkins watched as they homed in on their targets, a silent promise of Earth's defiance. He didn't need to wait for the explosions to know what would happen next. A flash lit the horizon as the shells found their marks. The alien ships erupted in flames, their retreat cut short by Earth's precision strikes. Talk's command ship shook violently, its engines faltering, and Jenkins knew the end was near. "Lieutenant," Jenkins said, turning to O'Donnell, "this is only the beginning." The young officer swallowed hard, his face pale. "What now, sir?" Jenkins stared into the distance, where a new formation of alien ships appeared on the horizon, larger and more menacing than before. "Prepare the howitzers," Jenkins said, his voice calm. "We're not done yet." The ground was still vibrating from the final barrage when Jenkins stepped away from his command post. The air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke and dust, and the distant echoes of alien engines dying out reverberated through the hills. O'Donnell stood beside him, staring at the horizon where the last remnants of the alien fleet had once hovered, now reduced to flaming wreckage. "They didn't stand a chance," O'Donnell muttered, almost in disbelief. His hands still trembled slightly from the intensity of the battle, the adrenaline coursing through him fading but leaving its mark. Jenkins didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on the remaining wreckage, his mind already calculating the next move. Victory had come swiftly, but he knew better than to assume it was over. This was a taste of what the Warlords were capable of, just a test. The real battle had yet to begin. "Don't get comfortable," Jenkins said, his voice low but firm. "They'll be back." O'Donnell blinked, pulling himself out of his reverie. "Back, sir? After what we just did?" Jenkins finally turned to him, his face impassive. "This was only the first wave. We rattled them, but they won't make the same mistakes again." A tense silence fell between them as the implications of Jenkins' words settled in. O'Donnell glanced back at the other soldiers, who were celebrating with hesitant relief. They hadn't heard Jenkins' quiet warning, but it was clear the sense of victory wouldn't last long. Suddenly, a distant, sharp tone pierced the air, a signal from one of the comm stations. Jenkins stiffened, snapping to attention. O'Donnell immediately reached for his headset, his expression shifting from relief to unease as the incoming transmission crackled through. "Commander, you need to hear this," O'Donnell said, his voice tight. Jenkins grabbed the headset and listened. His eyes narrowed as the voice on the other end relayed urgent information. New alien signatures had been detected. Larger, faster ships were moving in from the outer atmosphere, already within striking distance. Jenkins' jaw tightened. "They're sending reinforcements," he muttered. "Bigger ships. More firepower." O'Donnell paled. "How many?" "Enough." The ground rumbled once more, but this time it wasn't from their own artillery. A low, menacing hum began to fill the air, growing louder with each passing second. Jenkins looked up, his eyes scanning the sky. Far above, just barely visible through the haze of smoke, dark shapes began to emerge. Massive alien warships, far more advanced than the ones they had just defeated. O'Donnell followed his gaze, his face going white as he saw the size of the approaching ships. "What do we do, sir?" Jenkins didn't hesitate. "We prepare. Get the crews ready to reload the howitzers. Every round we have needs to be primed. I want those guided munitions set for immediate fire." O'Donnell snapped into action, shouting orders to the men as they scrambled to reload the artillery. The celebration was over, and the reality of their situation hit like a hammer. The aliens weren't retreating, they were regrouping. Jenkins moved toward the command post, his mind racing. The first assault had been a surprise, a success because they had caught the Warlords off guard. But now, the aliens would come prepared. Their new ships would have stronger defenses, maybe even countermeasures against the explosive rounds that had crippled them earlier. Jenkins had expected this, but not so soon. He needed a plan, and fast. O'Donnell returned, his face set with determination, though Jenkins could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Sir, we've got all the munitions loaded and ready. But with ships that size, do we even stand a chance?" Jenkins didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out over the battlefield, his eyes lingering on the howitzers, the last line of defense they had. The artillery was powerful, but they were still fighting a war against an enemy whose technology far outstripped their own. The guided munitions had worked once, but now? "We make every shot count," Jenkins finally said, his voice firm. "We hit them where it hurts. And if that doesn't work, we find another way." O'Donnell nodded, though the unease hadn't left his face. "Understood, sir." The sky darkened as the alien ships drew closer, blocking out the sun. The hum of their engines grew louder, a constant reminder of the imminent attack. Jenkins kept his eyes on the ships, calculating, analyzing every detail. He could feel the tension building among his men, their fear barely contained beneath the surface. But fear was a weapon he could use, one that would keep them sharp, keep them fighting. "Lieutenant," Jenkins said, his tone quiet but commanding, "I want a scout team to watch for weaknesses in those ships. Anything that looks like a vulnerability, you report it immediately." O'Donnell nodded and moved to relay the orders, his voice echoing across the battlefield. Jenkins continued to study the incoming ships. They were slowing now, preparing to strike. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Every decision he made now could determine whether they survived or were obliterated. Suddenly, a bright flash illuminated the sky, and Jenkins' stomach dropped. One of the alien ships had fired, a brilliant streak of energy heading straight for their position. Without thinking, Jenkins shouted, "Brace for impact!" The ground shook violently as the blast hit, throwing debris into the air. Jenkins hit the dirt, his body slamming into the ground as the shockwave rippled through the base. The sound was deafening, drowning out everything else for a moment. When the dust began to settle, Jenkins pushed himself to his feet, coughing as the acrid smoke filled his lungs. His ears rang, but he could make out O'Donnell's voice through the chaos. "Commander! Are you all right?" Jenkins waved him off, wiping blood from a small cut on his forehead. His eyes swept the battlefield. The howitzers were still intact, though several men were down, wounded or worse. But they didn't have time to assess the damage. "We need to fire back, now!" Jenkins barked. He could see the alien ships hovering just out of reach, preparing another strike. If they didn't hit first, they wouldn't survive the next round. The crews scrambled to reload the howitzers, their movements frantic but focused. Jenkins felt the tension tighten around him like a noose. The alien ships had the advantage, but if they could get off one more shot, maybe, just maybe, they could turn the tide. As the first artillery round was loaded, Jenkins stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. He raised his hand ready to give the order. But just as he opened his mouth, a new signal crackled through his comms. "Commander Jenkins, we've picked up something else," the voice on the other end said, panicked. It's not just the ships. They've deployed ground units. They're coming for us from all sides. Jenkins froze, his eyes widening as the realization hit. The howitzers weren't their only target. The enemy was already here. Lieutenant, Jenkins said, his voice low. We're surrounded. O'Donnell looked at him, stunned. What do we do, sir? Jenkins' jaw tightened as he stared at the approaching alien ground forces. The situation had just gone from bad to worse. Prepare for close combat. Jenkins could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him as the enemy closed in from all sides. The distant sound of alien machinery, the rhythmic thumping of ground forces moving into position, filled the air with a relentless tension. He had faced overwhelming odds before, but never like this, never against an enemy this advanced, this determined to wipe them out. Sir, we're completely surrounded, O'Donnell said, his voice shaky but controlled. Ground units are closing in fast, and our long-range artillery won't be effective at this range. What are your orders? Jenkins stared into the distance for a long moment, his mind racing. The alien warships still hovered above, preparing their next strike, while their ground forces rapidly encircled the human defenses. They were coming at him from two fronts, and it was clear their strategy had shifted. They weren't just here to overwhelm with sheer firepower. They wanted to break them, crush the human spirit, and leave no survivors. Hold your ground, Lieutenant, Jenkins replied, his voice hard and resolute. We can't retreat. If we fall back now, they'll pick us off like insects. O'Donnell nodded, though his expression betrayed his doubts. Understood, sir. But with artillery out of play, we're going to need something else. Something to hit them back harder. Jenkins turned to him, his eyes narrowing. We've got the howitzers, and they're still operational. But we need to change our tactics. These ships, he pointed toward the looming alien vessels overhead. They're too well defended for conventional strikes. We're going to focus on the ground units. We take them out, and we force the ships to stay airborne. That buys us time. O'Donnell swallowed hard, wiping the sweat from his brow. And if the ground units break through? They won't, Jenkins said, his voice cold and absolute. Not if we outsmart them. He motioned to the scout team that had been watching the battlefield. They rushed over, sweat dripping from their faces as they reported the situation. Commander, they're fast. Their armor's thick, but they've got weak points at the joints. If we can hit them there. Good, Jenkins cut him off. Relay that information to the artillery crews. Target the joints. We need to cripple as many of those units as possible before they reach our line. The scout nodded and sprinted back toward the artillery team, and Jenkins turned to O'Donnell. Get the close combat units ready. We'll need to hold the line if they push through. O'Donnell hesitated, glancing at the howitzers behind them. But sir, if we focus on the ground units, won't we be leaving ourselves exposed to the ships? Jenkins' jaw tightened. That's a risk we're going to have to take. If we waste time trying to hit both, we'll lose everything. The ships can't land if we keep the ground forces at bay. O'Donnell opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say a word, the air crackled with energy. A beam of blinding light shot from one of the alien ships, slamming into the ground just meters from their position. The explosion threw up a massive cloud of dirt and debris, knocking Jenkins and his men to the ground. The force of the blast rattled his bones, and for a moment, everything was a blur of smoke and noise. Coughing, Jenkins pushed himself to his feet, blinking through the dust. His ears rang, and his chest burned from the shockwave, but he forced himself to stay focused. Status report, he barked, his voice hoarse. O'Donnell, covered in dirt but otherwise unharmed, staggered toward him. We're still intact, sir. They missed us by a hair. Jenkins clenched his fists. The aliens weren't just testing them anymore. They were preparing to finish them off. Get those guns firing, he shouted. Now! The artillery crews scrambled into action, their movements fueled by adrenaline and desperation. Within seconds, the howitzers roared to life, launching a barrage of rounds toward the incoming alien ground forces. Jenkins watched as the first shells exploded on impact, tearing through the alien ranks and sending their massive, armored units toppling to the ground. "Direct hits!" O'Donnell yelled over the noise, his face lighting up with a glimmer of hope. "We're slowing them down!" But Jenkins wasn't satisfied. The alien units were still advancing, their numbers overwhelming. The howitzer rounds were hitting their mark, but it wasn't enough. The ground shook as the alien forces pushed forward, their relentless march cutting through the smoke and debris like a tidal wave. Jenkins grabbed O'Donnell by the arm, pulling him close. "Get the close combat teams in position. We're going to need every man we've got on the front line." O'Donnell nodded, his expression hardening as he relayed the orders. Within moments, the human soldiers formed a defensive perimeter, their weapons drawn and ready. Jenkins could see the fear in their eyes, but he also saw something else: resolve. They knew what was at stake. There was no room for failure. The alien ground forces broke through the final layer of smoke, their towering forms casting long shadows over the battlefield. The humans braced themselves, their rifles trained on the advancing enemy. Jenkins stood at the front, his hand steady on his weapon, his eyes locked on the nearest alien soldier. The first shot rang out, followed by a cacophony of gunfire. The close combat teams engaged the enemy with everything they had, their rifles blazing as they fought to hold the line. Jenkins fired round after round, each shot aimed with precision, each bullet a desperate attempt to slow the alien tide. But the aliens were relentless. For every unit they brought down, two more took its place. Jenkins could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of the battle pressing down on him like a vice. His men were holding, but just barely. He knew it was only a matter of time before the line broke. "Commander!" O'Donnell's voice cut through the chaos, panic evident. "We're losing ground." Jenkins' heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing. He had to make a decision, one that could turn the tide, or doom them all. "Fall back to the secondary position!" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. "We'll regroup there." O'Donnell relayed the command, and the human soldiers began to fall back, their movements coordinated but tense. Jenkins covered their retreat, his weapon hot in his hands as he fired at the advancing aliens. His heart raced as he watched his men pull back to the secondary defensive line, a series of trenches they had hastily constructed earlier. Just as Jenkins moved to join them, a blinding light filled his vision. He had only a split second to react before something massive struck the ground in front of him, sending a shockwave that knocked him off his feet. He hit the ground hard, his breath forced from his lungs as the world spun around him. Through the dust and smoke, Jenkins caught a glimpse of what had landed, a towering alien unit, larger and more menacing than anything they had faced so far. Its eyes glowed with an eerie blue light, and its massive arms flexed as it began to move toward him. Jenkins struggled to push himself up, but his body felt like lead. The alien unit loomed over him, its shadow swallowing him whole. For the first time in the battle, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. "Sir!" O'Donnell's voice reached him from the distance. "Commander, get out of there!" But Jenkins couldn't move. His body wouldn't respond. He was trapped. Jenkins awoke to the sharp taste of iron in his mouth and the muffled sounds of chaos around him. His body felt numb, but the pain in his head throbbed with every beat of his heart. Dust hung thick in the air, making it difficult to breathe. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear his vision. The last thing he remembered was the massive alien unit standing over him, ready to deliver the killing blow. But now, all he could see were flickering lights and shadows moving erratically through the smoke. A hand gripped his shoulder, and Jenkins flinched instinctively. O'Donnell's face came into view, pale and streaked with dirt. "Commander! You're alive!" Jenkins groaned as O'Donnell helped him to his feet. His body protested with every movement, but he forced himself to stand. He could hear the sounds of battle continuing in the distance, the unmistakable crackle of gunfire and explosions shaking the ground beneath them. "What happened?" Jenkins asked, his voice hoarse. He tried to shake off the dizziness, his mind scrambling to catch up with the situation. "That unit," O'Donnell began, his eyes darting nervously around. It almost killed you, sir. But something hit it. I don't know what. There was a flash, and then it went down. Just collapsed. Jenkins swayed slightly, but he managed to steady himself. His eyes narrowed as he surveyed the battlefield. The towering alien unit that had been seconds away from crushing him lay in a twisted heap, sparks flickering from its ruined joints. Whatever had saved him, it had been quick and precise. They're still advancing, O'Donnell continued, his voice tense. The ground forces are pushing through the western flank. We're getting overwhelmed. We need orders, sir. Jenkins clenched his fists, forcing himself to focus. His head throbbed, but the urgency of the situation cut through the haze. He couldn't afford to falter now. Not when everything was hanging by a thread. Rally the men at the secondary position, Jenkins ordered, his voice stronger than he felt. We hold the line there. No retreat. O'Donnell nodded, but the hesitation in his eyes was clear. Sir, if they break through the secondary position. They won't. Jenkins cut him off, his tone absolute. We stop them here. As O'Donnell hurried off to relay the orders, Jenkins took a deep breath and surveyed the battlefield again. His men were fighting valiantly, but it was obvious they were being pushed to their limits. The alien ground units were relentless, their precision and coordination far beyond anything Earth had faced before. And yet something nagged at the back of Jenkins' mind, a detail he couldn't shake. How had that alien unit fallen so easily? It was as if something else had intervened. A loud explosion tore through the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of metal crashing against metal. Jenkins snapped his head toward the source of the noise and saw one of the human artillery units, its defenses crumpled, being overrun by an alien soldier. The sheer size and power of the enemy forces were overwhelming. He forced his legs into motion, pushing through the smoke and chaos to join his men at the front. The heat of battle surrounded him now, bullets cutting through the air, explosions shaking the earth. Jenkins reached the defensive line just as a squad of his soldiers was driven back by a wave of alien attackers. Without thinking, Jenkins grabbed a rifle from a fallen soldier and opened fire, his shots precise and deliberate, dropping two of the advancing aliens. Hold the line! Jenkins shouted, his voice cutting through the cacophony. Don't let them through! The soldiers rallied at his command, their resolve strengthened by the presence of their commander. They fired back with renewed energy, pushing the aliens back, if only for a moment. Jenkins could see it in their faces, exhaustion, fear, but also a flicker of hope. Sir! O'Donnell's voice called out from behind him. Jenkins turned to see his second-in-command running toward him, a look of urgency on his face. We've got reinforcements inbound. I think it's from one of the off-grid sectors. They're jamming the alien signals. Jenkins' eyes widened. Reinforcements? From where? O'Donnell hesitated, his expression one of disbelief. It's an unknown faction, but they've got tech we've never seen. They're targeting the alien command ships. Jenkins frowned. This wasn't part of the plan. Reinforcements from off-grid sectors? Tech that could disrupt the alien systems? None of it made sense, but there was no time to question it. If they had allies, whoever they were, they needed to capitalize on it. Get me a visual on those reinforcements, Jenkins ordered. I want to know who we're dealing with. O'Donnell nodded and hurried back toward the communications unit, while Jenkins turned his attention to the skies. The alien ships were still hovering ominously, but now, for the first time, they were showing signs of disarray. One of the ships, a massive behemoth at the center of the formation, suddenly veered off course, its engine sputtering as if something had gone terribly wrong. Jenkins narrowed his eyes. Whoever these mysterious reinforcements were, they were doing something powerful enough to destabilize the alien fleet. But why now? And what were their intentions? His thoughts were interrupted by a new sound, one he hadn't expected. A deep, rumbling growl. Jenkins spun around, scanning the battlefield, trying to locate the source. His eyes landed on the horizon, where a new wave of movement caught his attention. What is that? One of his soldiers muttered, stepping back in shock. Jenkins followed his gaze, and his blood ran cold. Emerging from the smoke and chaos was something different. Not an alien soldier. Not one of their machines. This was bigger, more monstrous, an enormous, lumbering creature, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Jenkins' mind raced. This wasn't part of the alien invasion force. It couldn't be. This thing was something else. Something worse. As the creature drew closer, its massive claws tearing through the earth, Jenkins felt the full weight of the situation crashing down on him. They were already barely holding the line against the aliens. Now, this new threat had appeared, and he had no idea how to stop it. O'Donnell rushed back to his side, his face pale. "Sir, the reinforcements, they're coming in fast, but I don't know if they'll make it in time. What do we do?" Jenkins stared at the monstrous figure approaching their position, his mind spinning through the possibilities. The reinforcements might save them, or they might be too late. And then there was the creature. Whatever it wasn't something they were prepared to fight. "We dig in," Jenkins said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Hold the line. We take out anything that comes at us." But even as he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something far worse than they had anticipated. And then the ground shook again, this time, harder than before. The creature roared, and the skies above them darkened as another wave of alien ships descended, their engines humming with renewed purpose. Jenkins tightened his grip on his rifle, his jaw set in grim determination. The worst was yet to come.